Immersion is a word that's thrown around a lot. Immersion this, immersion that, you gotta be immersed. You gotta be immersed when Todd Howard makes you buy Skyrim for the 5th time. To be immersive, a game needs to have a solid atmosphere to back it up, but nobody really ever spends too much time on what makes an atmosphere good and how to create one. A game's atmosphere is more important than you might think it is. It can be the difference between a game being simply fun and a game being something that's an experience you'll remember for a long time. I believe that there are 3 main components that make up or enhance a game's atmosphere: the visual design and art style, the lore and writing, and the music and sound design. Some games excel at one of these aspects and some excel at others, but it is when a game soundly captures all 3 of these elements that a truly memorable and immersive atmosphere is created. One of the most obvious ways to set an atmosphere is through a game's visuals. The art style of a game is incredibly important to give players an understanding of not only how a game might play out, but what kind of tone and setting that it encompasses. Probably the easiest comparison of using visuals to set a tone and atmosphere is comparing Half-Life 2 and Team Fortress 2, 2 shooter games both made by Valve that encompass very different themes and atmospheres. You have Half-Life with its drab, dark settings that set up this gritty and serious atmosphere that really sets the tone and gives context and understanding to the player of what type of a world Gordon Freeman is in. And then you have TF2 looking like this. Now this is a very serious game. Half-Life's setting and story would not be as impactful with the brighter and cartoony visuals of Team Fortress, and in the same way TF2 would not be as humorous and ridiculous in a gloomy City 17 style setting. While it's obviously mostly the art style that has an influence over this, a game not being technically sound will also have an effect on it. I mean, do you remember Mass Effect Andromeda? It's why many older games struggle to capture the same amount of immersion that newer titles do, particularly when it comes to visuals, so it's important to look back at older titles with historical context in this regard. It should go without saying that the art style that a game chooses should match what kind of atmosphere that it sets. If you're gonna make a psychological horror game, you won't want it to look like a cutesy anime dating sim. Or maybe you do. Juxtaposition is also an incredibly powerful tool and can be used to create a more satirical or motivated tone, or to emphasize when a game shows its true nature or its storyline takes a darker turn. A game's storyline and writing will also play a big role in how convincingly it sets its atmosphere. Obviously not all games really encompass a storyline, and many will have a fairly loose lore surrounding it, but even so, the way that it is implemented into the gameplay is important. Having likable and interesting characters is important in a story-driven game, otherwise there's no reason for us to care about them in a dramatic or atmospheric scene. Having even basic lore or just some interesting dialogue and mechanics around it can give more context to a game and give you a reason as to why the gameplay is taking place, even in genres where a storyline is not really important. An example would be Apex Legends and Fortnite. In Fortnite, you're just killing each other out of the battle bus. In Apex Legends, however, there is at least some context for what is happening, and features such as the kill leader mechanic help to create a more competitive atmosphere. Despite the fact that nobody seems to even remember it anymore, the atmosphere that Apex Legends set was one of the reasons that I enjoyed it more than Fortnite. Voice acting is also important because if it sucks ass, it's not gonna help you, particularly if you're trying to set a serious or dramatic atmosphere. Good voice acting is always beneficial, even if it's just accompanying the gameplay. And then comes writing, which does not always necessarily have to be story oriented. Even clever tooltips and descriptions can go a long way to emphasizing what kind of a mood that a game sets. Despite it being more important for certain genres, the storyline and lore surrounding a game always goes a long way to setting a particular tone, and it is important to give players context and a reason to keep playing the game. I personally believe that music is one of the most effective ways to set tone in not only video games, but almost all forms of media. If it wasn't, we wouldn't have boss battle music, or music for different game areas, or really background music at all. Imagine a game like Stardew Valley with gritty, hardcore rock music blaring in the background, or a game like Doom with peaceful, quaint, fluty music in the background. You gotta make sure that the soundtrack matches the feature. Or again, maybe you don't. Juxtaposition is a very powerful tool and, to be honest, is largely underused in video games. Perhaps more ultra-violence to the tune of Mr. Blue Sky is needed. It obviously helps when the music is good too. My favourite game series when it comes to the soundtrack is without a doubt the Castlevania series, particularly the soundtrack from Order of Ecclesia. But the music isn't just good, it enhances the atmosphere as well. The triumphant ensemble as you march through the entrance of Dracula's castle, to the soft gloomy score that echoes through the deep dungeons and caverns, to the final haunting melody as you climb to the keep. The more intense music in battle compared to the more calm and carefree tracks in a town hub. The difference between the eerie nighttime music to the happy, joyous daytime track. A game's background music should always accompany either what is happening in the game world or what part of it the player is in. It's not all just about music, however. The general sound design of a game comes into it as well. Whether that's creating the atmosphere of a big slashy medieval battlefield or of a creepy uncharted forest, sound effects can also play a big role in creating a believable atmosphere. However, sometimes it's a lack of sound altogether that can be atmospheric. An empty ruin, walking up to the gates of hell. Sometimes silence is the loudest noise. And sometimes breaking that silence is the most powerful tool. The eerie tranquility of your new Minecraft world, when out of the silence breaks the calm, understated piano music that emphasizes this empty yet serene world around you. Sound design is an incredibly powerful tool to set tone and feeling, not only in video games, but across all forms of entertainment media. One of the best examples of a game setting a convincing and immersive atmosphere is Darkest Dungeon. In all three of my talking points, its visuals, its lore and narration, and its music and audio design, does Darkest Dungeon create the perfect atmosphere for the type of game that it is. The visuals are all dark and gloomy, so much so that nobody even has any eyes. From the character sprites to the town settings and the detailed backgrounds in each of the dungeons, the visuals are both aesthetically pleasing, but also dark and often horrific, which goes a long way to showing us what kind of a game this is. The lore that this game sets itself up around is pretty interesting, but by far one of my favourite features in the game is the narrator. Some might find him a little bit repetitive after a while, but by God, the voice acting is fantastic and very convincing. The sound design also enhances the mood. The eerie quietness when you trudge through the catacombs as it slowly builds up as it gets darker, to the sudden bursts of battle music during encounters. Not only is the gameplay in Darkest Dungeon knife edge and somewhat panic inducing, but the atmosphere is too. The game is already a lot of fun, but the atmosphere is what turns it into a truly memorable experience. I've talked about their games enough in this video, but Valve have always done a good job across the board when setting atmospheres for their games, particularly their Source Engine titles. Half-Life 2, Team Fortress 2, the Portal and Left 4 Dead games, all of these titles use the three different aspects I've covered to varying degrees and all have their own distinct and believable atmospheres and tones. In general, I think that most games do a good job at creating something believable and at least having appropriate visuals, stories and music to go with them, but it is when a game really emphasizes them and is able to combine all three where a truly immersive and memorable experience is created. As I've said, I don't think that the atmosphere alone is what makes a game good or bad, but an immersive and interesting atmosphere can make the difference between a game experience being good and great. It's obviously more prevalent in certain genres, and I'd say it's more important for games with a linear narrative, but it is still important to have a distinct and believable atmosphere for your game pretty much regardless of genre. It can be what turns a game from simply being fun to play to being something that will stick with us for a long time, to being something that we can fully immerse ourselves in and maybe just feel that little bit inspired by. Whether that's achieved through a game's visual design, through its narrative and writing, through its soundtrack, or a combination of all three, the believability of a game's atmosphere plays a big role of your overall experience, more than you might think that it does. And while it may not be what makes a game brilliant on its own, atmosphere in video games is what can make us lose ourselves in a title and create memorable moments. And I personally believe that the importance of setting atmosphere and tone is something that's largely underrated in the video games industry.